Good. It's my pleasure and privilege this evening to introduce our returning presenter, Dr. Jolene Erlacher. And though she's been with us for 2 sessions already, this being her third and ours, who really is Jolene Erlacher? I want you to think about that tonight. Well, she's an author, having written 2 books, one published by our own denominational publishing house, Judson Press, as well as authored countless articles. She's a wife, married to a wonderful guy named Matt. She's an entrepreneur, having founded Leading Tomorrow Ministries in 2014, providing coaching and consulting, speaking and strategy services to both individuals and entities. She's a speaker to corporations, educational institutions, military branches, faith-based ministries, as well as denominations, regions like our own, and congregations. How about an onliner? Writes blogs, makes podcasts, records videos, offers pre-recorded seminars and sessions just like this one. Oh, and we can't forget, she's a mommy to 2 beautiful twin elementary school age daughters, and a canine kid named Rex. And finally, she's an ENJF, which according to the Myers-Briggs Temperament Personality Inventory indicates she's extroverted, intuitive, feeling, and judging. So who again is Jolene Erlacher? In review, she's an author, a wife, an entrepreneur, a speaker, an onliner, a mommy, and an extrovert. Suffice to say, she's awesome. And we have the awesome opportunity to hear her again tonight. So without further ado, here's Jolene. Take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff. It's an honor to be back with you all tonight. And speaking of the elementary age kids, they're sitting here next to me tonight listening in, so it's kind of fun. I am going to, I just posted the notes for tonight in the chat box. So if you're interested in checking those out, go ahead and do that. And let me just see if I can get my notes up on the screen here so that we can see those as well. Awesome. Well, it was really, really encouraging to hear the presentation by Pastor Tim and Pastor James tonight. Again, just a great job putting together this information for all of us that just ties in with the topic for tonight. So thank you to everyone who's been coordinating just this wonderful series of events. I've learned so much and been so blessed just getting to participate. So tonight we're going to talk about mentoring across generations. And again, so many of these things already came up in the interview, so I'm excited to delve into them a little bit deeper. If you remember, I did say last week that while I was sharing a lot of information last week, this week we're going to get more into what do we do about this? What are the actual practical steps of engaging across generations? So tonight, I'm going to just jump and review a couple of things quickly in case we have any new people joining us. And then I'll also just review some of the traits and characteristics I didn't quite get to last week to kind of set up just the context in which we're mentoring these younger generations that are around us that we want to invest in. So I'm going to just walk through some of that, and then we'll get into the meat of what does it mean to mentor across generations. I think it was Pastor James who just talked about the research that shows the more adults that are in a young person's life, the better. And we also know the research shows us that the #1 predictive factor as to whether or not a young person is going to retain their faith through college or out of high school into young adulthood is if they have older Christian mentors in their lives. Somebody who they can look up to, someone they can confide in, someone that they trust, someone who they can maybe call at midnight when they need something. So this idea of mentoring across generations is incredibly important. Now, I just want to highlight again the generations that we're kind of talking about here. Here's kind of the numbers that I use, the years that I use as we talk about generations. And as I talked about last week, we see millennials and Gen Z, especially younger millennials born in the late 80s or early 90s and younger, really represent the generation that's been brought up in an entirely different cultural context than previous generations. So often we're going to see mindsets and perspectives that are very different, as well as sometimes behaviors. I highlighted again last week just the things that influence generations thinking and responding differently, life cycle effects, period effects, as well as cohort effects. And tonight I want to talk about, we talked a little bit about cohort effects last week. I'm going to touch on those just a little bit more. So things like parenting trends, technology, globalization, major world events, as we're even discussed already tonight, things like the pandemic or the social unrest, the racial conversation that's happening right now in our country. These things are cohort effects that leave a significant impact on a generation as they're developing their worldview. Of course, all this is being accelerated by technology. And so there's just some significant things right now that are cohort and period effects influencing this next generation. As I mentioned last week, Gen Z is the first post-Christian generation being raised in America, where a very small percentage have a biblical worldview, and their peer culture does not really just accept or embrace biblical values or morals. So we're just seeing this significant shift as we think about this younger generation. So just a few fast facts that are fun to kind of highlight to help put into context, especially Gen Z, or they're often referred to as iGen or Homelanders or some of the other terms that occur. The internet was commercialized in 1995, which is the beginning of Generation Z or iGen. So literally they have not known a world without the internet. Being a Gen Xer, I still have lots of memories of a world without the internet. I still remember things like dial-up, right? That's not going to be the experience of young millennials or Gen Zers. The oldest members of Gen Z, and this is just crazy to me when I think about how fast the world is changing, that the oldest members of Gen Z were early adolescents when the iPhone and iPad arrived. Can you believe that the iPad has only been around for 10 years? I mean, can you imagine what the pandemic would look like without the iPad or the iPhone, smartphones or tablets? So it's just amazing. And this generation has never known a youth, a period of adolescence without these interactive devices that are having a profound impact on them in many ways. Here's something that's really unique. With few exceptions, we're seeing generational trends appear across all demographic groups. So, socioeconomic status, racial, ethnic backgrounds, location, geographical location. We're just seeing a lot of the trends that I'm going to talk about tonight occurring across all demographic groups, which is unique. With millennials, Gen X, we saw some differences that were somewhat significant in these different, across these different demographics. Gen Z includes 74 million Americans. So they're roughly 1 out of every 4 Americans is a Gen Zer. And beginning with Gen Zers born in the late 2009 year, less than 50% are non-Hispanic whites. So young Gen Zers represent the first generational cohort where whites will be a majority minority in America. So again, things like diversity are very important to this generational cohort. Okay, so speaking of technology, let's look at some of the trends that we're seeing right now. Gen Z and millennials often average 8 to 12 hours a day on screens. This was before the pandemic. And here's what I like to just point out too. They are not alone. There are many Gen Xers and boomers and even some silent generation builders who are on their screens a lot. The reason is that screen technology, the interactive screen technology, is incredibly addictive. Um, so even if you don't need it all the time for work or for school, we're finding if you're using it, you often use it more and more, even in your free time, your downtime. So and now with the pandemic and so much being virtual, there is more screen time than ever. I actually just read an article today in the Chicago Tribune how students are petitioning the school system for reduced hours in the day because of the virtual fatigue that they're experiencing with headaches and just being overwhelmed by the screens. So we know that this is not necessarily always positive for their mental, emotional, physical health. So there's a lot of ramifications. Even while it's allowing them to stay connected, it can be really difficult. Studies are showing that young people feel insecurity and social anxiety in a virtual world. So here's something that those of us who are, 35 and older never experienced in the way that millennials and Gen Z have potentially experienced in their life, where I cannot control what other people are going to say and do and post about me. If I'm dating somebody and I'm 14 or 18 or 22, that person can break up with me and say scandalous things about me on Instagram or Snapchat or wherever and just trash my reputation, and I have no control over it. I was talking to a friend who there was a boy at her son's school who was taking pictures of other boys in the bathroom. So kids can take pictures or videos of other kids doing something that's embarrassing. They can post it. It can go virtual. They can be the laughing stock of their school or of their social circle without ever doing anything. So often their pressure to stay online is also to make sure that I'm monitoring everything that everyone's saying about me and other people. I don't want to be left out of that conversation. I don't want to be caught off guard. And even when they go to sleep in their bedroom, their identity is still at risk. Someone could be posting something, saying something about them. And so there's a lot of pressure that those of us who are older don't even understand or comprehend. I often like to say, there's like a whole invisible world that the younger generations are living in that often as adults we are oblivious to. There's pressures and stresses and cyberbullying and different things that are going on that are really, really difficult. One of the things that I often hear as I'm talking to teenagers is the fact that, we'll talk in a minute about mental health, is that often they have friends texting them late into the night because of things going on in their home with their parents, about depression or suicidal thoughts. And we have other teenagers and young adults trying to help their friends. And so, well, it's allowing them to connect. It's not always forcing them to go get the help that they need because they feel like there's someone there, but it's putting undue pressure on these young people. So even the young people who maybe are thriving and doing well, they're often navigating some of the stresses on their friends. So we're finding that depression and anxiety are often linked to social media use. And like I said, tech addiction's on the rise. And yes, Gen Z right now is the loneliest generation alive. There's a number of factors that are influencing this. A lot of it is just that not connecting face to face. The research shows that an emotional connection is made with another person when you make eye contact with them for 60% of a conversation. And often we even have parents and grandparents and friends and coaches who are so busy looking at their phones, or they're so busy and distracted. The Pastor Tim and Pastor James are talking about the busyness today. People are so busy, they're not actually just sitting and looking into each other's faces and having a conversation, which I believe in the midst of the pandemic, for some families and for some communities, it's actually allowed extra space and downtime to actually have that face to face. But if kids aren't making that connection, then it feels very, very lonely. And often their online relationships are very superficial as compared to what it would look like in person. And now with the pandemic, we have kids even more distanced from each other. So even while they were together physically, more prior to the pandemic, and technology was creating a level of superficiality in their relationships, which was causing them to sometimes not have high emotional intelligence to be able to read body language or facial expressions or tones of voice and these different things. And now with social distancing and virtual learning environments and kids wearing masks and people around them wearing masks, they're not able to read facial expressions or connect in the same way. So some of these things are even being compounded in the midst of our current environment. And so I share this because often it can be easy to just say, you know, why are they behaving this way? But they, again, like I said last week, they are not raising themselves and they're growing up with some incredible challenges. At the same time, kids are so resilient. And we're just seeing amazing giftedness and amazing innovation and amazing resilience coming out of this generation in many ways. And here's the thing, they are human. Despite the differences of their period growing up, they long for someone to just care about them. I was reading in the chat box earlier some comments about, I don't know how to connect with someone younger than me. Here's the thing, I've never heard a young person who resented the fact that someone older than them sincerely cared about them. And, maybe they're not going to always express it or show it, but to have someone who sincerely asks how they're doing, who looks them in the eyes, who tells them that they care about them, can leave a profound impact on a young person today because they desperately need that human connection. Okay, so technology is clearly one of those significant cohort effects, leaving an imprint on this generation. Let's look at some education trends. So what we're seeing is school is starting earlier and early and early for many young people today and lasting longer. So, I have twin 7-year-olds. I will tell you the pressure when they were 2 to make sure that they were in the right preschool so that they could thrive in life was amazing. I mean, you went to the park just to play with your kids and, every other adult there asked you what preschool they were going to. I was like, I want them to learn to play in the mud, like they're 2. So there's just incredible pressure on parents today to put kids in school very early. And there's not anything wrong with that or bad with that, but it's unusual. We're seeing a change. Whereas, 20 or 30 years ago, most kids were not in school, when they were 2. And so much time sitting at a desk or doing activities in a classroom, often now until they're finishing grad school 24, 25, they're learning amazing things. This is the most educated generation in our history. But sometimes then they are not learning real life things like how to wash the dishes, how to make a meal, how to, wash my clothes or do the laundry or change the oil in my car, change a tire, just really basic things because they're spending so much time in school or in other programmed activities like sports, which are all wonderful, but they're just not spending as much time just being with an adult. Like I think about growing up in the summers, I would spend them at my grandma's house. I learned how to can. I learned how to cook. I learned how to deal with my grandpa. I learned how to handle relationships by just following my grandma around all day, every day. I can still remember just sitting on the couch folding laundry with her and having her tell me about life and about, things she's learned. And I carry those with me. I sometimes feel like my grandma, even though she passed away, almost a decade ago, I sometimes feel like her voice is in my ear all the time. And I learned so much from her. So kids today are not getting that just quality time with an adult who's paying attention to them the way that in the past we sometimes had it. Standardized tests are often teaching to the test. There's so much pressure on teachers. I teach a graduate program for K-12 teachers, and there's so much pressure on them for scores that often they're like, we don't have time to teach kids what they really need to know because we have to teach the test so that we can get the funding and all of those things. So often kids are not necessarily being engaged in the joy of learning, but they're having to memorize information to spit out on tests, which is not cultivating that love of learning in them in some cases. Collaborative education, so students today, Gen Z and millennials, they are wonderful at working together. They've grown up with teams and groups working together. They're very used to learning from peers like we talked about last week. They're very open-minded, but sometimes student-centered education, which we've shifted to in the last 20 to 30 years, where we really format the education to fit the student rather than the teacher teaches the way that is most comfortable to the teacher and all the students need to relate to the teacher. Now there's pros and cons to all things, right? Most things. And what we're finding is that well, it's wonderful because kids who maybe have specific learning struggles are able to get the accommodations that they need. At the same time, in some cases, students are not being challenged to actually overcome some of the obstacles and figure out how to work through, some of their difficulties, which helps gain confidence and resilience that, if I'm with a difficult boss someday, or I'm on a team where I don't connect with people, I've learned I know how to cope. I know how to press through. So there's definitely pros and cons to some of these shifts. With technology, what we're finding is that teachers are needed more for interpretation than information. So I teach at 3 different universities, and my students can Google in 5 minutes more up-to-date information on the topics that I'm presenting on than I learned, of course, in my doctorate, 10 years ago. So as a result, young people don't always need mentors, teachers, leaders to give them the information. They need help. They have so much information coming at them all the time. The research shows we're creating as much data every 2 years as was created in the previous history of the world today. And so young people just have so much information coming at them all the time. What they need is someone who will take the time and help them process the information that they're hearing, which is becoming more of what teachers, mentors, and other leaders are needing to do for young people. Okay, let's look at some parenting trends. So we are living, I apologize, we have beautiful fall weather here in North Carolina, and we've had bonfires the last 2 nights, and I've like inhaled all this smoke. So my throat is a little scratchy. So I'm gonna try to keep going, but excuse me as I take a few sips here. Okay, so in parenting, we're seeing some significant shifts, especially this is one of the main changes that occurred between Gen X and millennials, was how parenting occurred. So Gen X grew up as the latchkey kids. And what happened with the boomer generation, it was the first generation where we saw high rates of divorce. So there was, more single parent homes, more blended families than in the past. We also saw a lot of women working outside the home. And so in the midst of that, a lot of Gen Xers would come home from school, make their own snack, watch TV, do their homework until mom and or dad got home from work. Okay, so they were the latchkey generation, and I'm a Gen Xer, so I could say this. We grew up a little cynical, a little skeptical, a little rebellious at times. And so as a society, we realized, okay, this maybe is not the best way to raise kids. So we kind of really swung to the opposite extreme, where we really viewed children as wanted, as needing to be protected, as needing to be, encouraged. We want to build up their self-esteem. At the same time as the shift in parenting, which has really led to some of the changes we see with millennials and Gen Z as compared to older generations, is that the well-being of children began to dominate the national debate. Some of this was a part of just some high-profile child abductions, but there are other factors as well that kind of played into the whole society feeling like we really needed to protect children. And so, whereas Gen Xers and boomers got to play out on the street down the block where mom and dad didn't even see them, they'd be gone in the woods playing for hours. There were generations that had a lot of freedom. And in the midst of that, the ability to learn things like conflict resolution. How do you work out a conflict when there's not an adult around? How do you manage resources when you're building that tree fort? Or, how do you divide up teams and who gets to be the leader? So there was leadership skills that were developed, problem solving skills, conflict resolution, all these skills that were developed in the midst of free play for older generations that that millennials and Gen Z did not have those same experiences, because we started to have adults monitoring everything. Children had GPSs on them, via phones or devices. There were video cameras watching them. There's always an adult within reach to step in and resolve the conflict or to help negotiate, a conversation. And so with just the attention on kids, we do see young people, with millennials especially, we saw just a high level of trust in adults, a desire for adults to help. which was very, very positive. We saw a lot of millennials and a lot of Gen Zers who have very close relationships with parents, teachers, coaches, because adults were present and engaging with them. So there's some strong benefits, but on the offside, sometimes there's insecurity for young people who maybe didn't learn some of those skills that other generations learned in other contexts. We're seeing parents, teachers, coaches have a lot of fear of legal action. My brother, who is a high school teacher, has had the cops called on him because a student, complained because they didn't like something that he said, or he dropped, one day he literally dropped a marker on a table because a student was laying on the table sleeping. He just dropped a marker on a table near her, and she said that he had thrown an object at her. And so there's this sense that teachers, coaches don't want to do anything that might appear. I mean, there was a parent who told me she saw another parent have the cops called on her because she slapped her 3-year-old's wrist when he wouldn't follow directions. So there's just a lot of fear. Parental issues like insecurity, doubt, and fear are just kind of coming to the surface because of things like social media, right? So I make a decision about my, kids' schooling or their sports choice or whatever, and then I see all these articles, blogs, podcasts about how this schooling choice is the best and this curriculum is the best, and this, if you do this, you're going to ruin your child's education. And so parents are constantly comparing themselves to others. They're constantly hearing people critiquing each other. There's a lot of competition. I mean, it's amazing. My husband and I coach our 7-year-old's soccer team. I told my husband, it's one thing to talk about these things in presentations. It's another thing to live it. I mean, I just have to not even follow other parents in the league on social media, because just the competition, the statements that are made, I'm just like, are we really adults? These are 7-year-olds. So there's just so much going on that parents are having to navigate in the midst of technology. Here's the thing. Parents today cannot ask their parents. I cannot ask my mom, how did you handle it when your 7-year-old wanted a smartphone? Or when she was asking why everybody else gets to play video games and she doesn't? How did you handle that? We have no roadmap to follow. So parents just feel overwhelmed. And often what's happening is that parents are overprotecting in some ways and underprotecting in other ways. So they're overprotecting in some ways, not letting kids go out or do anything that might be perceived as dangerous, but then handing them a smart device that has the internet that is feeding all kinds of anything to them, including the negativity of maybe peers. So this is not an easy world to parent in. It is very overwhelming, very stressful, and some of that is then having an impact on the kids, clearly. So we need to just extend some grace to all these parents as well as the kids that they're raising in this very, very unique context. Okay, so I mentioned this last week. Let me just run through these. I just like to highlight it because I do love Gen Z. They are practical, they are pragmatic. Like I said here, they work for success, they're future focused. We're seeing a drop in student loan debt because Gen Z is like, we do not want to be saddled with debt. So they want to know, how can I be successful? They often are putting a ton of pressure on themselves to be successful. They're very future focused. Like I said, they're very diverse. They're very cautious and realistic. They've grown up in a society where everyone's telling them safety first, safety first. They're collaborative, like we mentioned, and they're self-learners. They want to learn what they need to know right now. It needs to be applicable to this moment. So this is where sometimes like a Sunday school class is not as appealing as a mentor who I can call when I have a question and they can answer and help me process through the information I have that can apply right now, versus going to a Sunday school class and learning something that maybe doesn't apply to my life right now today. So this is where it can be harder to recruit for programs, but mentoring has a great place because they are self-learners, they're entrepreneurial, they're curious, they're well-informed, but they know they can get the information that they need when they need it because it's at their fingertips. So they want to know today what is relevant to them today. So I'm going to just pause really quick. Any questions? I'll just stop really quick. If you want to unmute yourself and jump in, or I have the chat box up as well. If you want to post some questions in the chat box, I can answer those. Or Mark, if I've missed any, or Jeff, anybody else, if you want to read, that would be great. I see the last one here. How do we help parents and children develop a healthy sense of self to be self-differentiated? Again, I would say mentoring is a great way to do that. We're going to get into that in a minute. I would say even mentoring parents. There are so many, I'm an older mom. And so there's so many young moms around me. I mean, I also have friends who are in their 70s who just speak life into me when I'm worried about things. So I think really that mentoring and helping people when they're in the midst of this process and think about these things is really, really valuable. Other questions?
There was a lot of people that appreciated you sharing about how younger generations have to monitor social media and actually were mourning the fact that they feel compelled to monitor and the stress that they experience. There was a lot of earlier chats in the chat box regarding that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, you know, something that I would say, if I really believe that churches, schools, I do a seminar on tech smart parenting. I've done it for churches, I've done it for school districts, for communities. And here's the thing, parents are so overwhelmed that with this, that sometimes they don't know how to set healthy boundaries and educate their kids on the use of technology. And what we find is the teenagers who actually have parents, youth leaders, others who will give them a break from technology and say, hey, I'm going to be the bad one who makes you turn that phone off for a half an hour during youth group or, you know, during family dinner or whatever. And they will fight it. But most young people do appreciate being given a break. So one resource I'll just share really quick is The Tech Wise Family is one of my favorite books. If you're just looking for a great resource for someone by Andy Crouch, I'll throw it here in the chat box. So if you are mentoring, or that would be a great thing to go through with a small group or a young, you know, couple parents that you're maybe mentoring, it's a great book. Okay, so I want you just to think about, and we heard some of these come out in the interview earlier. I would love people just post some of these in the chat box. What is a common fear, question, challenge you encounter regarding mentoring across generations? So now that we've kind of talked about who this Generation Z is and a little bit of millennials and some of the rest of us, I would love to just, you know, have you post some of the things that you may be seeing as fears or questions or challenges in your ministry context or in your community when you think about mentoring across generations. I'm going to try to address some of those as we're going. So go ahead and just post in the chat box if you have thoughts. Pastor Tim and Pastor James brought up some, like the busy schedules and different timeline, you know, time frames and things like that. But anything else, I'd love to see people just drop some things here in the chat box. Okay, so go ahead and do that. And I'm going to just kind of keep going here. So definitions of mentoring. There's different, you know, different things that people say about mentoring. I'm going to say they're kind of, they can all be applicable, but investing spiritually, intentionally in another individual or group of people, calling someone to growth and character development and encouraging them in that process, modeling, teaching a skill or a lifestyle, which is what it was discussed earlier in the interview. Doing life together is actually my favorite. And as we think about this pandemic environment where the world has changed so dramatically, in some cases, the doing life together has become more urgent and practical than maybe even some of the other things that we would consider more traditional forms of mentoring. But these are all different ways that we can mentor. Great comments. I'm just skimming through the comments coming in the chat box. So that's great. Continue to post those there. Okay, I really like to break mentoring into two different types of mentoring. And often when we think about church ministry, we're kind of thinking of one type, and then in our personal life, we kind of do a lot more of the other. But I just kind of want to break them down as definitions because, you know, depending on your context, if you're, you know, grandma or an auntie or, you know, a neighbor, it might look different than if you're a church leader, right? And trying to think about how to engage young people in your church context. So one type of mentoring, I like to call it lifestyle mentoring. And this is really that doing life together. And it's this ongoing process of like, we're doing life together. We're sharing life. I'm here for you. I'm available. I'm present. Young people desperately need this. This is what Pastor James was referencing earlier. This is what I'm saying is one of the predictive factors on whether or not a young person will retain their faith is if they have someone like this who's doing life with them. It doesn't mean you have to be there every day, but they know you're available if they need you. Specific mentoring tends to have a more intentional goal and tends to have a time frame. So maybe you're mentoring, a young person through a Bible study, or maybe you're mentoring them. I just think about our soccer team. We're mentoring our girls in their soccer skills. So it has some sort of focus. Maybe you're mentoring someone in budgeting, or, we're talking about other skill development. There's an intentional goal and there's a specific time frame. Okay. So some examples of specific mentoring, which is what we often see in the church as far as programs. Um, uh, I'm sorry. I just was told I'm calling them Pastor James. It's Pastor Josh. So I apologize for that. Pastor Josh and Pastor Tim. I apologize. I had the J right. Okay. Okay. So examples of specific mentoring would be formal scheduled relationship. So this might be where you're really more of a Bible study or something, or just a young person. I mean, I have a really good friend who's an amazing mentor, and she has several young women right now that she meets with intentionally every week. Depending on what's going on in their life, she's working through different books or different topics with them, maybe some spiritual disciplines. Then you might have more, informal, organic relationships, but they are scheduled meetings. Like I worked with one church on developing a mentoring program that it was organic. It was partnering women to just help those women with things that were going on in their lives, like if they're going through a divorce or if they had a sick child or something like this. So it was more informal and organic, but it was still intentional and kind of coordinated or planned. Coaching relationships, group mentoring, where you maybe have several people, going through a program together. One-time mentoring, where maybe somebody's, applying for a job in your field and they want to meet with you and be coached and mentored on that particular industry. So these are some things that we might see as more specific types of mentoring. I mean, in the church, you often have Bible studies or group studies, those kinds of things. Within youth group, you'd have small groups. So there is some of that going on. We're still doing a lot of that virtually, but a lot of that has come to kind of a screeching halt with the pandemic. And this is where I feel like there really is this incredible opportunity for what I call, a lifestyle mentoring. And I think there's really this challenge that we can kind of pick up right now of how do I do more lifestyle mentoring, or how do I grow in that, regardless of if you've done a lot of it or if you have never done it. I think there's a lot of opportunity right now for us to just engage this in a really meaningful way. I want to just share really briefly the story of Jochebed as an example, because when the pandemic first started, last spring, this was a story that God just really put on my heart that I've shared multiple times in regards to mentoring the next generation. As we're living through this current global pandemic, young people are just being profoundly impacted. And watching the adults around them live and lead during this time is going to have a significant impact on them. I believe it's going to be one of the most important period effects of this time. So I think it's really important to think about, how do we as leaders, mentors, parents, grandparents, neighbors, ensure that there are positive takeaways for this younger generation during this time. I actually think we've been given a gift in some ways, because it's one thing to teach a class on something. It's one thing to go through a book study on something. It's one thing to take a young person to the coffee shop and walk through a study guide and talk about hypotheticals. It's a whole nother thing to be in something together, walking with your community. And here's what often happens is that I, as a mentor of a college student, don't experience cyberbullying. I do not experience the same pressure on Instagram. I do not experience the same pressure that she's facing with the different dynamics in her world. So often as we're mentoring across generations, it can be hard to connect on something that is, relevant to all of us. We're not necessarily experiencing the same thing together. So we're trying to kind of identify with what someone else is going through. In the midst of the pandemic, we are all doing this together. We are all experiencing the impact of the pandemic. Now, how it's impacting us is different given our stage of life and all of this, but we're all in this together. So I just feel like we've been given this amazing opportunity to mentor together in an experience, which is how we all learn best, especially the younger generation. They learn, they are experiential. I talked about just that experiential learning last week a little bit. They experience through touching things, participating, engaging, connecting with other people. And so this moment has given us a pretty incredible opportunity for lifestyle mentoring. So let's look at some things that Jochebed did. First, when we read Jochebed's story, she was mentoring amid a crisis. I mean, here she is. She's a Hebrew mom living in Egypt when the Hebrews were slaves under Pharaoh. And in this moment, there's an edict from the king declaring that, all the young baby boys are to be killed. And so there is a clear cause for fear and terror. The world, there are scary things happening in the world. But what I so appreciated and was so inspired by Jochebed throughout, this past, year, is that she did not become paralyzed by fear. She did not deny or minimize her situation, the severity of it, but she did not become paralyzed by it. And by doing that, by trusting in the Lord and stepping out and just being courageous, she was able to model some powerful things to the people around her. I love it in Hebrews 11:23, where it says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And I just think that this passage has some really just encouragement for us to think about, how do I respond out of faith and not fear as I look to equip the younger generation around me for the crises that they are going to face in their lives. I just think about my own life and growing up on the mission field, where often, my parents, we experienced some crises, and watching my parents walk through some crises that were pretty significant with faith. It didn't mean that they denied them. My dad will tell you he was trembling with fear on some occasions, but I watched them still step out in faith. And it has given me a role model to reference when I think about things that I faced in my own life that have been crises. Second, instead of succumbing to what seemed like an impossible threat, she demonstrated creativity and innovation. And this is something God just really challenged me in. I'm a public speaker. I watched it as live events. My entire schedule cleared for about 6 months. I was like, okay, Lord, I was like, Lord, how can I be creative and innovative in the midst of this situation? I think we're modeling that here tonight, right? I love what your region has done in just putting together this creative, experience of the Biennial. So Jochebed looked around and she used what she had. She had a basket, a river, knowledge of the Pharaoh daughter's routine. Right where she found herself, she looked to find a solution. And I think that we can model this for young people today. They want us to partner with them. They are such a creative, innovative generation. So how do we come alongside them and engage them in this context that we're living through right now? Here's what I really love, and this has just challenged me in so many ways. She involved her children. She involved the next generation, letting them also experience God's provision. Sometimes we like to sit in our adult world and solve all the problems or worry about things or figure things out, and we don't invite the younger generation into it. And I think in this current context too, we have so many opportunities where my kids were just laying on the bed watching me do a virtual conference here in, down next to me. And so it's like they are watching us in ways, whereas typically I would have been in Pennsylvania right now, right? And so there's these unique opportunities that we have right now where we're together more and we can engage each other in this. Miriam was a young teen. She was engaged. Aaron, I can just imagine him, painting pitch on the basket. And then we know that Moses sat under the discipleship of his mother for those first precious years of his life before he went into Pharaoh's palace. So I think just thinking, how do we engage the young people, the youth, the young adults around us? How do we bring them into the conversation? How do we do what we're doing in life and in ministry with them? I think there's some real opportunities there. And then 4, she saw the bigger picture. Despite the pain that this whole situation was causing her, she's literally sending her child into Pharaoh's house. She surrendered. She trusted God and surrendered to his purposes. And I think what's so, let me just see, did I, oh yes, I did skip the slide. I was like, where's that verse? Okay. And here's what I think, as I was reading through the Old Testament, I was reading the Pentateuch when the pandemic, began last spring. And as I was reading through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, which are not always the most exciting, passages to read, I was just struck by this threesome, this trio, Aaron, Moses, Miriam, and how God used these 3 siblings. When do you see 3 siblings used to lead a nation through such a critical period of their history? I was like, what was it that led them to be these amazing leaders? Like, what inspired them to lead the people of God through crises like the crossing the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army coming down upon them and being enslaved in Egypt, and just crises and challenge after challenge? They were able to do it because they watched their parents. They watched other leaders leading them through a period of crisis in their youth. And I think today we have an opportunity to really just engage young people in how do we live with God's peace? How do we live with faith in God even when things are scary and overwhelming? How do we trust God's faithfulness? And helping model these things for young people today, I think, can be so important. So I get such inspiration as a mom, as a mentor, as a leader from this story. Okay, we talked about some of these things last week briefly. You're going to hear me say these things over and over and over because they're so important. I'll probably say them every week. But what are some things that we want to engage as we think about a lifestyle of mentoring? This kind of Jacobed approach. I think one thing that's so important as we think about the needs of Gen Z is they need to be able to process the information around them. They need someone to look them in the eyes. They need to know that there's someone there who's going to be consistent, is going to be there all the time, right? So one of the ways we can engage in their life is asking sincere, open-ended questions. Let me just give you some tips on this, because sometimes this can be really overwhelming when you're trying to engage, especially a teenager whom you're like, will they ever want to talk to me, right? I've learned that awkward silence is a powerful, powerful tool. So ask an open-ended question, something that they cannot answer yes or no, So even I like to have what I call my back pocket questions, and just have them in my back pocket, have them in the back of my mind. What are 3 or 4 questions that I could ask a young person? Think about them ahead of time, just even being able to point out something that I see that I value in them, and then asking them, hey, what is your greatest struggle right now in the midst of the pandemic? Or what have you learned in the midst of a virtual educational setting? Or, how do you think that this is going to change you going forward, or the world going forward? Something that requires more than a grunt or a yes or no answer. And then be okay with an awkward silence if you need it. And then smile, even if they don't say anything after, 30 awkward seconds. Follow up with another comment or question and smile. And don't give up. Come back the next time and do the same thing. Be consistent. So even if you just, every week or every time you see a young person, your neighbor kid in the front yard or whatever, you engage them with a smile, with a question, with caring, they're going to remember that. Even if they never respond, maybe in the way you expect or hope, it makes a profound impact. Listen, like I said, young people need that emotional intelligence. So model things like body language that leans into the conversation. Not crossed arms, not phone in front of you, but body language that expresses interest, that expresses you want to engage, asking follow-up questions, being present, allowing for time. I've had to learn this even with my own kids as we're homeschooling and I'm working from home. My husband's working from home, and there's lots of things pulling at us. Like when my kids walk in and I'm in the middle of an important email, you know what? That email, I won't even remember it in 2 years or 5 years, right? So how do I just pause and give time? I said this last week, but just sharing your own story, your fails, your struggles, being real when relevant. Here's the other thing is often, like I said last week, we're answering the questions that we think they're asking, or we're inviting them into something that we think they're interested in instead of seeking to understand what they're passionate about, what their questions are, what their needs are, and engaging with that. I remember working with one church leader who had women in their church who wanted to mentor the next generation, but they insisted, they were like, we want to teach them cooking classes and how to set the table and have a formal meal. These young moms with 2, 3, and 4-year-olds were not worried about how to set place settings. They were like, how do I survive right now when my husband is maybe not, he's working a million hours and I'm trying to juggle this. So it was the situation where they were trying to serve and mentor the next generation, but it had to be on what they thought they needed versus what the actual felt need was. So as we think about providing skills or opportunities, just really making sure that we understand what their interests or needs are and we engage those. Be willing to ask people who are younger than you for help in something. This can be a powerful way rather than us showing them how to do something. Sometimes it can be valuable when a younger person shows us how to do something. So this can be another powerful way for lifestyle mentoring. I have several young people in my life who I love to do this with. Be real. I think one of the most powerful things for a young person is when an older person apologizes to them. And so, I mean, even with like kids, I've had so many kids in my house the last 6 months as family and neighbors are homeschooling and doing virtual education. Like even with these kids, be whether it's a young adult in your congregation or a neighbor or whoever it is, just be sincere. Apologize if you need to apologize. Share your struggles. Like I said earlier, be real. Be consistent. Like I said, just keep following up. Model faith, hope, belief, engagement, even regardless of their response. And then when they request feedback, if you are in a more formal modeling conversation, or if you invite them into a project, get their honest feedback and receive it with grace. And this just has such a powerful, powerful impact on young people. I wanted to share a couple of fun little mentoring insights. I had a mentor who would always say to me, fruitful trees get picked. And I love that statement because what she meant was that people who literally are producing the fruit of the Spirit, that when people are around you, young people around you, they feel loved, they feel kindness, they feel faithfulness to them, they feel peace, they feel joy in a world that is scary and overwhelming. If you're someone who's full of joy and peace and love for them and kindness and goodness, they want to be around you. So it is something that is attractive to young people when they see somebody who is that. So one of my challenges as a mentor is just, God, help my life be one that is producing these things that this next generation desperately, desperately needs. Let it just flow out of my life. And when I feel like I'm getting text messages at midnight, because they're going through a crisis and I'm tired and overwhelmed, help me remember that the fruitful tree gets picked, right? Something else, that my mom would always say to me growing up, I'm the oldest of 6, that I think is powerful when we think of this mentoring lifestyle, is that your choices in lifestyle will impact your siblings, she said, more than anything your father and I say or do. And I think that sometimes we forget that just our choices in our lifestyle are speaking to someone. It was amazing. I was talking to my aunt, who my cousin is like 22 years younger than me, I think. And he grew up with my siblings and I. Most of us were much older than him. But she's made this comment to me this summer. She's like, you have no idea the impact of just watching you and your siblings' lives has had on your cousin. And I don't. I lived far away from him. I saw him periodically, but he knew the choices we were making. He knew how we were living our life. And so as I think through my life, sometimes I think about the grandmas, the women in my church, the leaders that have given me opportunities. I mean, just this week I was thinking there are 3 gentlemen who have been leaders in my life who gave me opportunities and empowered me in ways. And just watching them lead, even from afar, has had a profound impact on me. And so sometimes we don't even realize that our choices in lifestyle are impacting others. much more than anything that we say or do, or maybe even the people that are directly in their lives are saying and doing. So, and then something else, what you do in moderation, others will do in excess. One of my mentors always said this to me. She's like, if you gossip, the people that are watching you are going to gossip more. If you complain, the young people around you who are listening in when you don't think they're listening are going to complain more. If you encourage, they're going to be challenged to encourage. So I think this just being really aware that our very life, our very lifestyle is mentoring people sometimes when we do not even realize it or understand it, can be really, really powerful. So one thing I'd like to just encourage you to do right now, I talked about this a little bit the very first week, is just, who are the Daniels? Who are the young people around you, the Esthers, the Ezras, the Nehemiahs, that, are people that God is calling you to maybe invest in more intentionally. For some of you, it might be the formal, more of the formal, programmatic, specific mentoring where you're like, okay, this is a young couple that's struggling with their finances. I can sit down with them and walk them through, a financial plan, how to budget, how to process their different options or ideas. Maybe a young mom who's struggling with, technology, and you're like, let's read this book together. So let's meet once a week. So there's some of you may be feeling called. There's something specific I need to do. I know something specific. It can be, time kind of contained. We're going to do this for 4 weeks or 8 weeks or something. For others, there's young people that are in your lives. Maybe it's a young person that you see in church every week, but you don't know what to say to them. And that you can have that back pocket question and just be that person who always smiles, who always comes up and asks a question, who always expresses appreciation for them. That can have a profound, profound impact. I know I read in the comments earlier just the story of someone buying, I think it was a hot cocoa for a young woman at a game, and how that was so impactful. Young people, they want to be valued, they want to be noticed in this world that can be so overwhelming. So, who is it? I mean, God even convicted me in the midst of, things going on. Like, I have nephews who live down the street from me, and God's like, those are young people who I want you investing in. And so even this week, they were over for a sleepover and a bonfire and just investing into their life. So who is it that God has put into your life to invest in some way? And I want you just to even just write down or just share 3 names of who you could be lifestyle mentors to, and think about how do you want to engage these relationships more intentionally. Okay, I want to just read through here. I know there's been a lot of chat, but I just want to look at any of the challenges in case I didn't just address them before we kind of get into the next phase here. I know we talked a lot about busyness. That was something that came up earlier with Pastor Josh and Pastor Tim. And one of the things I would just say with that in the lifestyle mentoring kind of arena is, go where they are if you can. So, I mean, there's this lady at my kids that teaches my kids choir who will just show up at their basketball game. So sometimes even if they're busy, showing up where they are can be really, really important. A young mom, if you show up to help watch her kids or wash her dishes while she watches her kids, you'll have opportunities to share and to speak into their lives. Mark or Jeff or anybody, were there other challenges? I'm trying to find, the chat has been really busy, so were there any other challenges that came up in the chat box that I maybe didn't get to? Or if anybody wants to unmute and jump in, feel free to do that.
I think you covered a lot of these, Dr. Jolene. There was a pretty considerable discussion about just some of the challenges with public school or with school having influence on students' lives, whether that's high school or even college, and struggling with how to share your faith or to be able to be genuine in the midst of what can sometimes seem like the educational institutions teaching something contrary.
Yeah, that's a very real struggle. I literally was just doing a presentation earlier this week where parents were asking me that exact same question. Here's just a couple things that God has challenged me in. One is pray pray for our schools. Like I said, I teach grad classes for K-12 teachers. There are amazing teachers in the schools, and they feel overwhelmed sometimes by everything going on. I mean, there have been periods in my life where I just feel so compelled to I would literally just drive to our local public school, even though I did not have kids there. Drive to my local public school and just pray, sit in the parking lot and just pray. I cannot emphasize how much we need to just be praying for our schools, praying for our teachers. I think the other thing that's really powerful, if you are mentoring a young person who's in school, what we find is, again, having older adults who are walking with them and asking them, encouraging them, listening to what they need to process can be very helpful. Also, having a godly friend. In my book, Daniel Generation, I talk about the need for godly companions if you're going to live in Babylon, and how Daniel had Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You need those godly companions. So even praying with your young mentor or mentee, that God, if they don't have a godly friend, that God would bring someone into their life. So that can be something else that's really, really helpful. So just a few thoughts, but yes, it's incredibly challenging because often we're finding, maybe parents have them for 1 hour a day, grandma gets them to see them 1 hour a month, the church gets them 1 hour a week, and they're in school in these other contexts for hours and hours and hours. So yeah, great points. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and break you into out rooms here for the next few minutes. And I know some of you are already kind of in watch parties. So if you want to just discuss in your group, if you're with a small group there watching this together, you can just not join a breakout group and just kind of have your own side discussion. Otherwise, I'll break you into groups of 3 to 5. And I just want you to share so far. I'm going to still wrap up with a few comments here, but what is a takeaway for you or an action step for you personally today when you think about mentoring across generations, especially in this current context? What is a takeaway or an action step for you personally? And then second of all, how can the church encourage mentoring across generations? As you think about your particular church context, how can the church encourage this? Sometimes the church is not able to facilitate it all, especially right now with all the, with the pandemic, but how can we encourage people to do this mentoring across generations? So I'm going to go ahead and just break you into breakout rooms. Let's see, how are we doing on time? So we'll maybe chat for like 7 to 8 minutes on these two topics, a primary takeaway, and then how the church can encourage mentoring across generations. I love the pumpkin throwing contest. Okay, that's great. Okay, everyone, I'll go ahead and just join the room when you get the invitation. So we cut down on any echo. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up with a few. Hopefully you had some good conversation and were able to just kind of identify, again, in 5 minutes, that's a very short time, but hopefully start a conversation about things that you might want to take away from this session. I just want to end with just highlighting again a few steps. You've heard me say this already before, right? Cultivate relationships. One thing I would really encourage you to do. Sometimes people will say, why don't young people show up for our activity or our service project or our Bible study or whatever? Intentionally pursue an individual. You would be amazed that if you approach an individual and say, hey, we're doing this service project, or we have this Bible study, and I've just been thinking about you, you've been on my heart. I'd really like it if you would come with me. It would just mean so much to me. You would be amazed. It's one of the best ways to get young people to show up when they feel like they're individually pursued and that someone cares and values their participation. They're much, much more likely to show up. So I would just encourage you to think about if someone on that list or just someone else in your church or community maybe needs that individual intentional invitation. Again, we already talked about this, asking those open-ended questions. And I would say that as you think about the church, ask the young people in your congregation, engage them in saying, what would be meaningful to you? How do you want to serve? How can we serve you? And just asking questions and listening to them as well can be really helpful. Understanding, advocating for these different perspectives that are in our intergenerational context. Invite younger voices into the decision making. So we're going to talk about this next week when we talk about multi-generational teams and how do we create multi-generational teams. Again, it's critical. I've sat on multiple church committees and I serve on a couple of ministry boards. What I found is so important is inviting younger voices into those discussions, empowering them. So, looking at some of their ideas and seeing how we can maybe engage them, and giving them real, ways to contribute in a way that's meaningful to them. Again, communicating that belief. I said this last week, but I'll say it again, being sensitive what God's doing in the young people in your church. What is God stirring in their hearts? And how do we engage with what's already happening there, which might sometimes be different than the goals we initially set out with. Not that they were bad goals, but maybe there's just something different. So wherever you are in engaging young people, just really tapping into this. Again, as leaders, it is critical that we model mentoring through example. So when people see leaders, pastors, others mentoring and engaging young people, it helps them understand the importance of it. So not just talking about it, but actually doing it and modeling. And then providing opportunities. I think Pastor Josh or Pastor Tim brought this up at the beginning, just modeling up or providing opportunities for interaction or service together. Sometimes it can be really helpful to have something to do with your hands to help avoid some of the awkwardness of, conversation with people maybe that are not, your best friends and someone from a different generation. So I think just thinking about what opportunities and then encouraging people to intentionally invite someone. That can be another great way to engage. So just a few ideas about how to engage the next gen in our churches. Again, if you have questions throughout this week, please feel free to email me, jolene@leadingtomorrow.org. I'd be happy to address any specific questions or thoughts, or if you have ideas you want to share with the group. I would love this conversation to be ongoing, so feel free to email me. I was getting to read through some of the comments in the chat box. It's great as well. Like I said, next week, we're going to wrap up with really talking about multi-generational teams, succession, how do we engage the next generation for leadership. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Okay, so Jeff, I think I'm turning it back over to you. So
Actually, it goes over to the boss.
oh,
He'll wrap
perfect.
things up tonight.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jolene. Boy, great content. And I was just really struck by your comment that the pandemic is a gift to us. And boy, I don't think many of us could get our head around that, but I think you're right in terms of being able to relate to other generations, because it is certainly something we're all sharing right now. So good stuff. Thank you so much. Just a couple of notes regarding our time together. And as you see on the screen in front of you, we'll be getting together next Thursday night, the 22nd from 7 to 9, again, to talk about building a healthy multi-generational team. And just like we've done in the past, the Zoom link will be coming your way. And so we hope that you'll plan to join us. Additionally, we are going to be having, after next week's session, another after session gathering to have some additional conversation and a chance for us to kind of bump elbows with one another, to have some of that dialogue that we may not be able to have had if the time in the breakout room was a little short and there's some more topics that you want to be able to discuss. We want to give you the chance to be able to do that next week. And again, there'll be a separate Zoom link that will come out for that event as well. Hard to imagine that we're almost at the end of October here, but we also do have, as a part of our normal biennial gathering, we have a business session where we gather together to talk about some of the significant ministries that are taking place in the life of our region and kind of where we find ourselves. That's planned for Sunday, October the 25th, from 2 to 3:30 in the afternoon. And again, we'll have a Zoom link for that as well as a Dropbox folder. But we also do need for churches to sign up their delegates for that event. And so we will have some voting that'll take place during that. So we hope that you can, as church leaders, get those delegates into us, into Denise, and sign up on the form online. That would be tremendously helpful to us. But it's been just a wonderful, wonderful evening together, and grateful for all of your participation and time. if I may, give me the privilege of praying us out this night. Let's pray together. Gracious God, we come to you tonight with hearts that are full, Lord, at the wonder of your love for us, and at the tremendous opportunity that we have to be about equipping and engaging generations in our congregations. Lord, to grow in our relationships with one another in healthy ways that point towards you. Lord, thank you for our sister Jolene and for the learning that she has shared with us tonight. And God, we do pray that you would challenge us to think of those Daniels, of those Esthers in our lives, God, that you are calling us to relate to in meaningful ways. Thank you, God, for these moments together. Bless us now as we part, for we ask it in Jesus' name, and all of God's people say, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, friends.
Good night, ABCOPAD family. Night, Jim Bob. Night, Mary Ellen. Night, Grandma. Night, Grandpa. Bye, everyone.
Good night, Jeff.
Good night.